Is there cure for the US dollar? The February 9, 2017, 17:55 and 20 seconds. Mr. Yun Bai. The dollar crisis. The essence of credit money is a liability. And the credit correspondence is the ability to repay. This is easy to understand by common sense in everyday life. When we lend money to others, the first thing to think about is whether he can afford it. If it's due and not repaid, it's default. If borrowing in this daily life is magnified to the point where it is between countries, this default corresponds to a debt crisis. The debt crisis triggered a chain of debt defaults, which further blew up the credit crisis. If the country is a person, the credit of the country's local currency depends on its ability to repay. A country's solvency depends on the country's balance of payments and financial surpluses. That is, if the country loses its ability to repay, it will lose credibility. Without credit, the country's currency would not be held, or the cost would be very high. All economic crises, ultimately, are credit crises. The credit crisis, mainly through three stages. The first is the credit demand stage, the second is the credit expansion stage, the third is the credit collapse stage. In the 3,000 years of the vicissitudes of the Chinese civilization, we review the gold standard monetary system with the Central Empire as the core of the agricultural civilization. China's ancient gold standard system, in the book Guanxi in a very detailed discussion. Because of the recent hundreds of years, the global production center, from China to Europe, Westerners abolished before they spice standard currency system, and copy, and inherited the gold standard in ancient China. The Western gold standard, which began with Napoleon, was completed around 1870. The global market, and the global monetary system, greatly stimulated the prosperity of industrial production and free trade. Britain's export of credit to Germany led to the rise of Germany. France exported credit to the United States, leading to the rise of the United States. This stage is the demand phase of credit. The credit expansion of Britain and France led to the emergence of Germany and the US as a new global production center, leading to a glut of global production. Meanwhile, Soviet Russia and Japan are beneficiaries of the credit expansion. The prosperity of free trade, the great excess of production, the increase in the supply of gold unable to keep up with the increase in the supply of goods, will inevitably lead to deflation. In the words of Guanzhong, the phenomenon of deflation is called the scarce currency versus abundant commodities. Commodities are getting cheaper, and producers' inventories and revenues are lower than production costs in gold. This led to a large number of factory bankruptcies, which in turn led to a large number of workers losing their jobs and the global economy in the midst of a Great Depression. Deflation did not begin after the First World War, but began before the First World War, and it was severe deflation that led to the outbreak of the First World War. This is the third stage of the credit crunch. There was no fundamental solution to the deflation problem in World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was a terrible peace agreement. The Treaty of Versailles is one of the most vicious acts of a cruel victor in the history of civilization, Keynes wrote in his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace Treaty. The essence of the Treaty of Versailles was to carry the gold of the German treasury into the English and France. Because gold was removed from Germany, credit in Germany contracted sharply. The result has been to push Germany into deflation and the Great Depression. On the other hand, in the United States, the international balance of payments had a substantial surplus because of the great wealth of arms sales in the First World War. The United States has accumulated a lot of gold and needs credit expansion. With asset prices collapsing, Germany's labor and assets are at extremely low prices. So America's gold is a good deal for Germany. For capital, they naturally pursue cheap costs, because cheap costs mean high returns on investment. Germany benefited from America's credit expansion, and its power was restored in a very short period of time. To shift the low-end industry, Germany exports to the Soviet Union. Because under the gold standard, the assets and labor costs of the Soviet Union were cheaper than in Germany. Strong again in Germany, in order to get rid of the restriction of the gold standard, enable the land standard, issue new mark for land reserves, and through the barter trade, to get rid of the defects of lack of their gold reserves. After the wings had hardened, Hitler challenged American financial supremacy. Financial and economic success did not satisfy Hitler. The root of the world economic crisis, he argues, is the gold standard itself. He also believes that only material production is wealth and gold is not wealth. If the gold standard were to be destroyed, it would not be enough to complete the mission by barter trade and Germany's new mark. Because to destroy the gold standard is to destroy the political and military hegemony of the British and French. Hitler turned his attention to political appeals. He tried to defeat Britain and France and rebuild a new world political and economic system. This is the deep root of the outbreak of World War II. The Second World War ended with the victory of our allies. The natural defect of the gold standard was followed by the subsequent Bretton Woods system. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the supply of gold to increase as production resumed, and there was a serious shortage of relative supply. The currency is lighter, deflation is on the rise, gold is up 20% and the dollar is plummeting. The first dollar crisis occurred in 1960. In the mid-1960s, America's balance of payments worsened as the US expanded the Vietnam War. By the time the dollar hit a serious crisis of confidence in 1968, the world was selling dollars to cash in. In desperation, the United States had to intervene in financial markets with political means, forcing other countries to curb their gold exchange requirements. The second dollar crisis is not over, the third dollar crisis comes. In 1971, when the United States had a once-in-a-century trade deficit, people were again questioning the dollar's credibility. There has been a massive wave of dollar selling in European markets. All the people were crazy about gold and German mark. In the midst of an extremely chaotic international financial order, the group of 10 Western nations reached the Smith Agreement. Under the agreement, the Nixon administration announced that the dollar would depreciate against gold, and that the dollar would stop trading in gold. The building of Bretton Woods began to tumble. In 1972, the balance of payments in the United States continued to deteriorate, and people lost confidence in the value of the dollar. In the international financial market, the dollar crisis broke out again. Facing a tidal wave of people into gold, the U.S. government in February 1973 was forced to declare the second post-war dollar depreciation, 10% for gold dollar depreciation, namely gold official price from $38 per ounce again to $42.22. But that didn't hold up confidence in the dollar, which was once fired at $96 an ounce. In this case, the Western countries negotiated an agreement to cancel the fixed exchange rate for the dollar and announced a floating exchange rate system. At this point, with gold as the anchor, the reformable fixed exchange rate system with the dollar as the center completely disintegrated, and the Bretton Woods system completely collapsed. At this point, the gold standard was over and gold was out of the history of the monetary system. With the end of the gold standard, Nixon designed a new monetary system for the United States, the petrodollar standard. In the gold standard of the dollar crisis, in essence, is a golden crisis. All credit systems are anchored in gold. With the opening of the standard system, the oil crisis has replaced the dollar crisis over and over again. 2. Oil standard. Under the dollar's gold standard, the credit base of the dollar is that anyone who holds dollars can redeem the equivalent gold. The U.S. government has an unlimited liability for dollar holders. Under the petroleum-based system of the dollar, the credit base of the dollar is that anyone who holds dollars can buy oil in dollars. The system requires that the United States have a strong military deterrent to ensure that oil producers cannot trade in other currencies other than the dollar. At the same time, the use of force to deter oil consumers, to buy oil, must have a large reserve of dollars. The United States provides the dollar and the deterrence of force. Oil-producing countries are responsible for producing oil. Oil-consuming countries are responsible for reserves of dollars for oil purchases. Oil producers, because of the oil trade, have accumulated large surpluses, and then send back to the United States to balance the U.S. trade deficit. At the same time, oil-consuming countries, which have a large surplus of dollars, have to return to the United States to balance the U.S. trade deficit. This creates an petrodollar circulation. From a purely monetary point of view, why can oil replace gold? According to China's traditional monetary system and financial culture, gold can be the king of money because it is rare and gold is rare, so gold is a natural currency. But is oil rare? Not rare. The so-called oil ran out in a few decades was all hype. What is the currency logic that replaces gold standard with oil standard? The answer is American deterrence. Force controls oil producers, arms control of the oil trade routes, and the ports and fortresses of the shutters. Although oil is not scarce, it is indispensable and irreplaceable as industrial energy. This is the logic of the dollar's oil standard. In the gold standard, because gold was inherently scarce, deflation was inevitable as long as supply of goods increased too quickly. And the gold standard had to deal with the challenges of the material producers of Hitler and Stalin. The United States was involved in World War II, the United States fought the Vietnam War, and from a financial perspective, it was all about maintaining the gold standard. If Hitler or Stalin were to win, the gold standard would be thrown into the dustbin. America's gold reserves, too, will be worthless. In the eyes of two producers, Hitler and Stalin, gold was not wealth at all. They all liked bartering. The United States was mired in the Vietnam War in order to maintain the gold standard. The expansion of the war led to an increase in debt, and the balance of payments deteriorated. People sold dollars and exchanged gold. Why did Nixon not dare to continue fighting? Because again, American gold would be run out. America's approach has hurt America's aims. What's the point of this war? Stopping the war in Vietnam did not prevent the gold standard from collapsing, and the crumbling Bretton Woods system was inevitable. Gold fell, oil was high. We said that because oil does not have the natural scarcity of gold reserves, and it is concentrated in mining, not as dispersed as gold. It is not scarce, and production can be controlled artificially. This is the characteristic that the gold standard monetary system does not have. This also means that under the oil standard system, the credit expansion of the dollar will not be limited by the scarcity of monetary anchor. And, the dollar's oil-based system, power and duty are separated. In the gold standard era, you can exchange gold only if you hold US dollars. Debt repayment is God's righteousness. The credibility of the dollar is based on the repayment of debt by gold. In the oil standard era, you have the dollar. What can the United States do for you? It can't do anything. The dollar is a blank check. The answer is, you have the dollar, you can go to oil-producing countries for oil. The United States is in debt, and oil producers pay. Debt repayment is no longer valid. This kind of power and duty is equitable. It is the deep root of Middle East chaos. Why did Iran break out of the Islamic Revolution, from pro-American to extreme anti-American? The reason is that Iran has assumed an obligation to compensate the dollar, but has not enjoyed the right to do so. Oil is held in the hands of American agents, and most of Iran's people do not enjoy the oil trade benefits. Ever since the dollar switched from gold to oil, there has been no dollar crisis. Instead, the oil crisis erupted. The dollar crisis was caused by doubts about the creditworthiness of the dollar, so the dollar was sold for gold. In the oil standard era, the dollar was originally a false credit. Everyone sold dollars, exchange oil. Oil is not scarce, and there is no oil conversion. Therefore, oil standard, not only the dollar is false credit, oil is also a false anchor. So why the oil crisis? The oil crisis is a financial instrument directed by the United States to strip oil consumers of their dollar reserves. Too large a surplus of oil consumers and too much dollar reserves can cause serious international trade imbalances. How do you get the oil consumers to dig up the dollar reserves and get the oil prices high? In the age of oil, the variables here are Russia and Iran. Oil prices are high, and Iran and Russia are taking advantage of the oil trade. Once Iran and Russia completed the accumulation of capital, they'll turn economic power into military power, seeking to break the force of the United States hegemony, break the obligations and rights under the oil standard system, pattern of unequal, maximize their self-interest. Thus, Iran and Russia will seek direct trade with China, the biggest oil consumer, to remove the US oil trade middleman. Then the oil standard will die. To avoid this, the United States has directed the plunge in the price of oil in order to kick off Russia and Iran. In the American oil standard system, oil price rises, defrauds China, oil price drop defrauds Russia. As we said earlier, the premise of oil standard is the deterrence of force. If anyone dared to challenge the dollar's oil standard, America would wage war to punish them. Saddam, Gaddafi, these challengers, were executed. But the challenge is Russia. In order to punish Russia, the United States moved the war in Ukraine. As a result, Russia annexed Crimea directly. Venturing in Ukraine ended up like the saying, "Go for wool and come home shorn." The United States continues to move the Syrian war. The result is more unsatisfactory. This eclipse is not a problem of a small loss, it is likely to erode the base of the petrodollar standard. The Russia-Iran-Turkey tripartite agreement has left Israel and Saudi, as well as American mercenaries ISIS, on one side. If the future of the Middle East is dominated by Russia-Iran-Turkey, the dollar's petroleum-based foundation will cease to exist. Russia's energy needs to be exported to Europe. It needs to go through Turkey. Chinese goods will be exported to Europe. Turkey, unless it is a fool, will not turn a blind eye to such a huge opportunity. So it makes sense for Turkey to turn its back on America. It is Turkey's bright future, because it is Europe's toll road. Turkey will eventually lead to the oil euro, becoming a gateway and a bridge for Europe to connect to the East. For Iran, to be able to get a dividend from the oil trade, it needs to be a regional power. This is inseparable from China's support. Iran will guide the oil currency. For Russia, the United States is not justified in using force to control oil trade, and Russia will become the largest oil producer, and it will need to break the current petrodollar standard. It is in Russia's national interest to establish oil rubles. The future of the Middle East is the combination of the renminbi, the euro, and the ruble. As for the dollar, if America loses its ability to control global oil trade by force, the dollar's credibility will quickly collapse. After losing the force control of the oil trade and provide credit support for the dollar, the US can't wait to energy revolution, promote the development of shale gas and shale oil. Is oil really scarce from the energy revolution of recent years in the United States? There is no shortage of it. The United States is prepared to defend its oil-based monetary system as much as possible. If it can't, it can be followed by a domestic energy production, with a subsequent credit support for the dollar. Otherwise, the dollar really will turn into waste paper overnight. From the 1970s, the petrodollar standard monetary system was established. In the past few decades, the dollar has been brewing a super credit crisis. Like the dollar gold standard, the petrodollar standard also experienced credit demand, credit expansion, and credit collapse. We are in the midst of the oil-dollar credit crunch. Its mark is that the United States no longer has the power to subdue the world by force. False credit, false anchoring, on this day, is like the naked swimmer after the ebb tide. The expansion of the oil-dollar credit, which has benefited manufacturers such as China, has led to serious overproduction. At the same time, because oil is not scarce at all, the credit expansion of the dollar is a lack of restraint, leading to a credit surplus. The characteristics of our current global economic crisis have never been seen in history. Because it presents a double excess of overproduction and credit excess. In the gold standard, there was either excess production or a credit surplus. There has been no case of production surplus as well as credit surplus. This scene is so weird. It also reflects that in the age of industrial civilization, no real money has been found. World War I, World War II, and the present chaotic world, are all because we can't find the perfect industrial civilization currency. Gold and oil, the flaws are obvious. Now, a serious and pressing question facing the world is, if the oil standard is broken, will the dollar collapse? What does it mean for the world economy if the dollar is to collapse? In order to save the dollar, in order to avoid such an outcome, the United States has no choice but to resort to force. Until the real perfect currency came along, there seemed to be no way to survive, end free trade, erect trade barriers and start more wars. Between the great powers, the curtain of an arms race has been drawn. 3 carrier standard. Behind the credit of the dollar, it is the oil standard, behind which is the carrier standard of the deterrence of force. The United States military system, established to maintain the oil standard. On one hand it is to fight and control oil-producing small and weak countries in the Middle East. On the other hand, it is to seize the maritime and land trade routes that control the oil trade. The purpose of the U.S. control of Afghanistan is to block China's direct access to the oil-rich states of Central Asia, or to block China from opening another route to Iran. On land, the United States is trying to keep China's power at home. The United States wants to control Malacca, in order to control the offshore oil trade routes and choke points. In a nutshell, America's strategy is to hold the small country in the hands, to block the big powers at home, and to charge for it on the main road. This is the heart of the United States currency domination of the world in dollars. America's national security strategy, as well as the armament system, is based on maintaining oil standards. Now the situation has changed, the big powers are coming out, China is rushing out, Russia is coming out, Iran is not a big country, and it is coming out. This is an urgent requirement for the United States to transform its military strategy, from the maintenance of the oil standard system to the arms race for the general war. America's military systems of the past are largely useless for big countries. Many people believe that the United States will soon have a war with Russia and China. How to fight? There's no way to fight, because that's the kind of country like Iraq. It is a shame to take the arms used against a country like Iraq and to engage in a general war of great powers with China and Russia. In other words, the United States is very inadequate in preparing for war. In preparation for war, the United States urgently needs to reconcile with Russia in order to avoid war with both China and Russia. That's what Hitler did to Stalin. America's strategy for Russia is mainly for this purpose. There is no realistic condition in the United States. It would be unrealistic to ask Russia to help the United States fight China, just as Hitler made Stalin do the same for Germany. Mr. Putin should not repeat his mistakes today. The first important strategic issue for the United States is to avoid two fronts of war. The second important strategic issue is the return of manufacturing. Mr. Trump's manufacturing backflow is essentially an arms race, and job creation is a cover. Because of the lack of a complete and large manufacturing system, it cannot support the general war of great powers. As soon as the war started, there was nothing to be done, and the logistics would soon collapse. From this point of view, Chinese companies, if they respond to Mr. Trump's call for manufacturing repatriation, migrate to the United States, which is an indirect investment to assist enemy. The third important issue for America's arms race is money. Mr. Trump wants the best, but the US government has no money. The US government had no money, not only the people of the United States also have no money. If in the open market, interest rates soar, as the US economy vulnerable level, high interest rates will destroy the US economy. Where did the money come from? What Mr. Trump can think of is to get the oligarchs, through tax cuts, to strike deals with the oligarchs in exchange for their support for an arms race. The second channel is to unleash the spirit Americans of the world, to change the dollar, to use the money of other countries, to develop armaments and to fight against other countries. Business owners move manufacturing to the United States as an enemy, and Chinese residents change dollars, which is also an enemy. Of course, the residents change the dollar, and it is only a small play. The major players in the dollar are the big financial compradors. They are hundreds of billions of dollars in exchange for dollars, and Hong Kong is their money laundering center. To make money, with such ridiculous ideas, I don't know how Trump came up with it. The fifth and more important thing is the carrier battle system, which is not useful for the general war of great powers. But the United States is only good at this. If the battle system at the core of the aircraft carrier is to be destroyed, then China and Russia will have a general war. Is there any new combat doctrine in the United States? Now, not yet. The aircraft carrier is the same thing as bluffing a small country. Against great powers, it can only serve to block the sea route. Why the United States has stressed that the South China Sea is the core of American interests, because if the South China Sea is China's control, Chinese fighter planes and medium-range ballistic missiles, based in the South China Sea Reef, can blow up Malacca, so US forces of the Malacca Strait, survival becomes dim. If it loses control of key waters and key waterways, the carrier loses its meaning. Will China send the Navy to Hawaii and fight the US aircraft carrier? Apparently not, to have that kind of combat environment. If China can destroy Malacca's airports and ports and get air power, then send bombers and fighters to clean it a few more times. America's current war doctrine, and its combat system, have lagged behind for its future war purposes. In an arms race, America has lost ground. To save the dollar, an arms race is a drug that seems to work. But this medicine, distant water, can't quench immediate thirst. And, in America's antiquated military doctrine, the medicine is likely to be a poison. In addition to the easy-to-understand oil standard and carrier standard, Americans are seeking new anchors for the dollar, as well as many other fanciful plots to keep the dollar alive. For example, climate standard, food standard, and so on. Climate standard. Gold is the anchor of money because it is scarce and precious. Oil is the anchor of money because energy is needed for industrial production. What else, in this line of thought, can be the anchor of money? Carbon emissions are one of them. Global warming, the Global Climate Conference, carbon emission rights, carbon trading, together, constitute the carbon standard system of the dollar. Carbon standard is a climate standard. It has to be said that Americans are very whimsical. Carbon emissions are similar to those of ancient Europeans. Why do Americans come up with such a whimsical idea? because it is a Western tradition to have a wide range of mental patients. In ancient Europe, there was not only the fireplace tax, but also the window tax, the gate tax, the chimney tax, the wallpaper tax, the wall brick tax, the glass tax. To live, to eat, to cook, as long as the fire to cook, the chimney always smoke. As long as the chimney is smoking, you can tax the chimney. The carbon right is the industrial civilization version of the smokestack tax. In modern civilized society, the tax on carbon emission, which is directly levied on the chimney tax, does not sound appropriate and everyone is not satisfied. What to do? You need to prepare a set of lies. The basic theory behind this set of lies is global warming. As long as people are convinced that the globe is warming, if we stop global warming, we can save humanity. Then humans would willingly accept the right to emit carbon. And the Americans, from beginning to end, manipulated and controlled the climate conference and the carbon trading market, so the carbon trade was priced in dollars and settled in dollars. We see the global warming, the climate conference, the Earth Hour, the PM 2.5, the smog hype, and the documentary Dome, the hands behind them, all financial wars. Carbon trading, not to save humanity, is essentially a financial war. All the hype surrounding the carbon-based financial war is a sham. Can we cure the dollar by using these virtual heads? Mr. Trump is a pragmatist who believes only in material power. He probably thinks these things are self-deceiving, so when he took office, he immediately repealed the Obama climate bill. Spend so much money, the big expense Zhejiang defraud, is not as good as the money saved, used to develop armaments is more real. The United States is the master planner and operator of the climate standard, and if the US pulls out of the scheme, it means that the future of the hype surrounding carbon emissions will be lost. For fifth column, this is another dog food. In order to save money, Mr. Trump has cancelled not only the dog food of the climate war but also the culture war dog food that has been infiltrated by ideology. Can carbon standard make the dollar survive? Even Trump has cast it away like a broken shoe, so it doesn't work. Food standard. The core of agriculture lies in the seed industry. The core of seed industry is breeding technology. If you control the seeds, you can control global agriculture. To control global agriculture, people need to buy food as long as they eat. As long as they buy food, they have to grow food. As long as they grow food, they need to buy seeds from Americans. As long as you buy the seeds, you get the dollars and the settlement. This system is the food standard idea of the dollar. The core of it is the transgenic technology. Is GM really just a biotechnology? Is it true that GM represents science, and does it really mean pseudoscience? Not at all. The nature of GM is a financial war orchestrated and directed by the United States. Therefore, all walks of life should have some financial awareness, rather than the subject matter. The real world is far more complex and sinister than people think. The current global arable land, and of the world's population, don't need through transgenic technology to raise the per unit area yield of grain, as long as the fallow arable land are full of food in the United States, was enough to feed the world's population. Moreover, GM technology cannot significantly increase the yield per unit of grain, especially wheat and rice. It is a misconception that many people believe that GM can improve food production. The purpose of GM is not to increase food yield per unit of food. It is to control and monopolize global food production and agricultural production. Find the next anchor for the dollar. Genetically modified seeds, once sown, will contaminate non-GM seeds. This genetic pollution is irreversible. If China's crops are tainted with genetically modified crops, if China wants to do non-GMO breeding, there will be no clean seeds available. In this way, the Chinese have to be controlled by American breeders for generations. American breeding companies and biotechnology companies have cultivated many agents in China. They have labeled all opponents of GM as pseudoscience under the banner of popular science. This is a terrible science terrorism. Fang So and So, a network, a shell net, these people and these websites, are people who work for money. And there are fools who are brainwashed to work by their own. At the top, they infiltrate China's State Council, where they infiltrate Chinese universities and various levels of research. The power of capital is too scary. If a country, its social elite, has been trumpeting these lies for a long time, people will find these lies as science. At the industrial level, these American seed companies and biological companies, as well as local Chinese enterprises, have formed a number of joint ventures to infiltrate the seed industry in China and cultivate compact buying power. Food security is not a joke. If foreign investment is allowed to be used to refer to China's public opinion, and the Chinese agriculture, then China's future food security will be subject to problems and be controlled by people. If agricultural sovereignty is lost, the United States can use it as a threat, forcing China to be fully tied to the dollar. The food dollars would be a great success. For now, the United States is trying to save money by cutting dog food in all directions. China, on the other hand, is also starting to beat the dog. These dogs, which is a banner for foreign transgenic technology, is also beginning to be gradually cleaned out of education and scientific research institutions. This reversal suggests that the dollar's food standard has also been aborted. It is not a good medicine to live on food dollar. There is no medicine to save the dollar. From the above analysis, we can see that the credit collapse of the gold standard forced the dollar to switch to oil standard. The basic problem of the current global economy is that the oil standard will also face credit collapse, which is getting closer and closer. When the gold standard collapsed, oil was found to survive. If the oil standard collapses, what will the dollar be able to switch to? Climate-based design has been abandoned by Mr. Trump. The food standard, as long as China clears out the foreign agents, is viable neither, which is not a good medicine as Chinese government shot it off with the turn of a switch. The digital standard, represented by Bitcoin, can be copied, and in the end, it is the competition of electric power for mining. Bitcoin is not the anchor of the world's reserve currency, compared with gold and oil. The gold standard is the European monetary system and financial and cultural inheritance from China in the past. Accurately, it is the residual of agricultural civilization and industrial civilization, is also a transition of agricultural civilization to industrial civilization. Oil standard is an interim and immature attempt in the era of industrial civilization. To this end, the world has endured an unprecedented expansion of credit bubbles, suffering from the massive false credit boom. In retrospect, if Hitler had won the Second World War, or Stalin had won the Cold War, all the false prosperity and credit bubbles of the present might not have existed. Or, if China's Great Leap Forward was successful, China would become a superpower in the short term, ruling the world, and the current false credit bubble would not exist. Our current thinking about the economy, the idea of finance, may be all wrong. If we are not wrong, how can we get to the point where we are unable to clean up today? The price of this mistake is the total collapse of a super credit bubble. Is there a bigger mistake than the fact that debt doesn't have to be repaid, and creditors don't care about it and build a global credit system? This is a mockery of credit. The more serious mistake is that people are still relying on the false credit of the dollar, economic dependence, and spiritual dependence. In retrospect, even if China and Russia carve up the oil standard, it is still a continuation of the oil standard, and the continuation of this mistake will not solve the fundamental problem. The internationalization of the renminbi has a long way to go before it is stored as an anchor. A currency, the fundamental premise of the international reserve currency, is that it will not be anchored in another currency. Does America need a lot of foreign exchange reserves? Does the dollar need to anchor other currencies? Nature doesn't need it. Only the outer currency needs to anchor the base currency. If you don't anchor the dollar and anchor a basket of currencies, what is the real anchor of the yuan? If we find this anchor before the post-dollar era, then the dollar will be replaced by the yuan. We can avoid more chaos. The weathering and disintegration of the gold standard was accompanied by a series of wars and chaos. Now the oil standard is about to decay and disintegrate, and the dollar has no cure. A simmering volcanic world is about to erupt. Only after all this chaos, the real answer can be found. Because only by destroying an old world can we build a new world.